The Parkinson's Podcast is brought to you by the Davis-Phinney Foundation and brings you the stories, wisdom, and expertise of people living with Parkinson's, care partners, and Parkinson's professionals. In this episode, Dr. J. L. Alberts explores the impact of forced exercise on Parkinson's symptoms. Recorded at one of our educational events, Dr. Alberts' research continues to shape exercise studies in Parkinson's.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing in Parkinson's and exercise. So, again, this is intended to give you a little bit of a history of what we've done and then where we're going in the future in terms of our research. Parkinson's, we all know, it's a degeneration of the basal ganglia, et cetera, et cetera. But what I want to focus your attention on is the loss of dopamine neurons. Something that many of you probably know. Typically, levodopa is very effective early in the disease in terms of treating the cardinal signs of Parkinson's, bradykinesia, akinesia, the slowness of movement and difficulty initiating movement, and some postural problems as well. But as the disease progresses, oftentimes dyskinesias become a side effect of extended levodopa use. So one of the things that we're trying to do, again, is try to see if we can potentially intervene earlier so we can maybe keep this window open longer and wider. So how do we do that? Well, if you look at the data and studies in animals, there's a type of exercise called forced exercise that's been very effective and shown to be somewhat neuroprotective in rats and mice, models of Parkinson's. What we do to create a Parkinsonian-like rat or a mouse, because they don't typically get Parkinson's, is we give them some chemical, a 6-hydroxydopamine or MPTP, depending on the species, and basically make them Parkinsonian-like. And if you put a healthy mouse on a running wheel, if anybody has a mouse or any pocket pets, as my daughter calls them, they will run on treadmills all day long. But once we give them this drug to make them Parkinsonian, we put them on a treadmill or a running wheel and they don't move. So what we have to do, and what my colleagues have done, put them on the motorized treadmill, and you would think that they would be able to run. Well, what happens, again, they don't want to run, so they fall off the back. So what some clever folks have done is put the mouse or the rat on the treadmill and they turn it on, and if the mouse doesn't keep up, they get a little shock to help them to run. So that is called forced exercise. It's forced exercise because they are forcing the rat to run or the mouse to run at a rate faster than they would on their own if they just left them on a treadmill or a running wheel. Those studies have been exceedingly productive and very valuable in terms of showing improvements in motor function and neuroprotection. In general, voluntary exercise in Parkinson's, there's abundance of literature showing that there's benefits in terms of the cardiovascular benefits. So Parkinson's patients can improve from a cardiovascular standpoint in terms of after exercise. So all of those benefits are good. But there haven't been any real definitive patterns with respect to the improvement of motor function or global motor function or real large clinical trials with respect to neuroprotection. And in fact, there was a Cochrane review a few years back, and they concluded that there was insufficient evidence to support or refute the efficacy of exercise in Parkinson's disease. Now, another part of that review, they had two weaknesses. They said, one, that the results were relatively small when they were found, and two, that they were not long-lasting. Now, I will give it to the Cochrane group to say those are true, accurate findings in the sense that they weren't very large, and there are a number of reasons for that, and we'll discuss those in a little bit. But the other one, that it's not long-lasting, is a little bit of an unfair criticism of exercise, because my response to those individuals would be, well, if we don't continue taking your medication, then the effects of medication are also not long-lasting. And if you don't continue with deep brain stimulation, if you turn the stimulators off, those effects also are not long-lasting. So I think the take-home point here is that exercise is not the panacea. It's not going to be the cure that you can exercise for 8 weeks and then miraculously you're cured. But it becomes a lifestyle change and something that you have to embrace. And just like taking medication on a daily basis, you probably need to engage in exercise on a regular basis. Probably not daily necessarily, but based on our studies, but it's certainly something that you have to ingrain in your lifestyle. So again, voluntary exercise improves health-related quality of life, strength, and balance. But again, the impact on falls and depression is not very clear. So these are things that we're looking at in our studies now is fall rates and also these non-motor symptoms. But again, there's no systematic data out there with respect to human data and neuroprotection. So why are the mixed results? Why did the Cochrane group say that there are small effects? Well, the varied exercise interventions in terms of the dose. Some studies have patients exercising once a week, 3 times a week, 5 times a week. In the intensity, again, all over the board. You have to remember that many of these exercise studies are really funded on a shoestring budget by small organizations or even internal funds. And so they're not like a standard multi-site clinical trial where you can actually recruit a very somewhat of a homogeneous population. So I think we're evolving to that, where we actually can get NIH and other organizations to fund larger clinical trials so we can actually better understand the precise effects of exercise on Parkinson's, and can we potentially slow its progression. So again, this is why these studies have suffered. Again, small sample sizes and mixed patient characteristics. The other part is that all of these studies have used a voluntary mode of exercise. So when I say that, I compare that or contrast that with forced exercise, right? Forced exercise was where the rat or the animal was forced to exercise at a rate faster than they could voluntarily or on their own through the administration of electricity. Now, these studies have used voluntary exercise. They could be rowing, they could be any type of weightlifting, any type of exercise that's voluntarily controlled by the patient. And so that's, again, based on some of our observations and data, that may be an area of why, or a reason why some of these data have not come to fruition. So the fundamental question that we're asking, or that we're talking about today and in my lab, is exercise really medicine for Parkinson's disease? So my insight or my interest really came in 2003. In 2003, a small group of folks, myself and then Ralph and Kathy Frazier. Ralph was a big cyclist, and Kathy wanted to spend more time with Ralph, and we were at a holiday party, and possibly after a few cocktails, someone came up with the idea that, hey, why don't we ride a tandem bike across the state of Iowa? And Ralph and Kathy, husband and wife, can ride together. They can have this wonderful, beautiful moment. So Ralph and Kathy, the idea was they were going to ride the tandem bike across the state of Iowa. We were going to raise awareness that Parkinson's isn't a death sentence. You can be active. Well, that was a great idea in theory. So they made it through about the first half of the first day. Again, this is a 7-day ride. And Ralph and Kathy had been chatting, and Ralph actually got off the bike at the midpoint town, and he forgot that Kathy was on the back. So she fell over, and there were talk of divorce and everything else, and here I am feeling bad that here I've brought this couple here, and now we're going to have all these problems. Being the good guy from Iowa, I said, hey, Kathy, why don't I ride with you for the rest of today, just today? And so it turned out that Kathy and I had a great time on the tandem together, probably because we were not married, and I ended up riding with her for the rest of the week. And so a couple things happened. She said, when I was on the bike, it didn't feel like I had Parkinson's. And that's why I say, was it the pie or the pedaling? Because as we make our way across the state of Iowa, we eat a lot of pie and ice cream and things like that. But then the other thing that happened that was very interesting was that she wrote out, or there was a birthday card at our campsite. And in the very back of that picture on upper left is a guy named Gary McCarthy. And she wrote a card that said, happy birthday, Gary. And I looked at that, and I said, who wrote this card? Because if you'll notice, there are just guys in the rest of the group, and other guys where I'm from don't write other guys' birthday cards. And so she said, I did. Isn't it amazing? And I said, it is, because her handwriting looked beautiful. And so this was sort of our first inkling that maybe there's something going on with this exercise. This really struck me, and I was like, okay, now we need to figure out how can we potentially close the gap between these really promising animal studies and the studies from humans that were not as promising. So we started to think about it, and I started thinking about what's going on a tandem bike. Well, if you think of a tandem, both people have to pedal at the same rate because the front and rear people are linked mechanically via a chain. And so when I would pedal with Dave or with Kathy and other patients, I would typically pedal at 80 to 90 RPMs, whereas on their own, they pedaled around 50 RPMs. So in essence, what I was doing is I was forcing them, sans the electricity, to pedal at a faster rate than they could on their own. And so the other thing that we were looking at, and that is very similar to what we're doing or what we do with the animals with the forced exercise, right? Again, we're making them exercise faster than they can on their own. A couple things to remember or note, though, is that certainly you're aerobic, so you have to get your heart rate up, and we've been using 65 to 80% of their target heart rate zone based on American College of Sports Medicine requirements. The other fact is that it's really key is that the participant is not passive. So it's really easy to put a motor on a bike or anything and just turn it on and get your legs to be moved really quickly. So it's really important to understand that that's not what forced exercise is. The participant is actually actively contributing to the movement, because if they don't contribute to the movement, you're not going to see any change in function. And we have a lot of studies on that with Parkinson's, but even a larger set on patients with stroke. You can move their arm and they actually show no functional gains and no changes in the brain unless they actively move as well. So we think of forced exercise, though we call it forced, and that may have a negative connotation. We really almost think of it as sort of a helping hand or a helping or assistive type exercise. So where are we now? Well, we've come from the cornfields in just an observation to clinical trial to actual practice. Our initial study in 2007, where we did a clinical study, initial clinical study with an actual tandem bike, to now that we have developed a motor-driven cycle, again with an algorithm that controls the contribution of the motor while monitoring the contribution of the patient. It's important to note that you can't just put a motor on a cycle and spin someone's legs really quickly. So what's the rationale? Certainly, again, I'll run through this quickly in terms of just showing you that the important part here is that what we're trying to do is to augment the voluntary activities of the Parkinson's patient to get them to exercise at a rate faster than they could on their own. So we had, in our initial study, our intervention was we randomly assigned patients to a forced versus voluntary group. They came into the lab 3 times a week for 8 weeks. We did a 10-minute warm-up and a 10-minute cool-down. In between there, we did a 40-minute set. The forced exercise group pedaled at 80 to 90 RPMs, whereas the voluntary group pedaled at whatever rate they wanted. But they both were observed or monitored by an exercise physiologist, and also were exercising at the same aerobic intensity. So the only difference, so their heart rates were about the same. The only difference was the voluntary group pedaled at whatever rate they wanted to pedal at, and the forced group pedaled on a tandem with one of my postdocs at a rate of 80 to 90 RPMs. So again, the forced group was pedaling faster than the voluntary group, turned out to be about 42% faster. So what we did is we measured the amount of torque or force that each foot is producing during a pedaling stroke. Both patients in voluntary exercise and forced exercise produced an asymmetry. One leg produced more force than the other, which is not terribly surprising, right? But then after 8 weeks of exercise, if you look on the bottom plots, you can see the voluntary, again in red is the right leg and blue is the left leg, they still have this asymmetrical pedaling pattern. But the patient in the forced exercise group, who we've augmented their pedaling rate, now has a little bit more symmetry between the two limbs. So again, we find this encouraging, one, in the sense that we're potentially improving lower extremity function. And now we're engaged in studies to see what are the specific effects of that in terms of gait and postural stability. But the other part that was really exciting for us was the changes in upper extremity function. So this is a patient who was randomized to the forced exercise group. If you look at her handwriting, and I've circled that in the red there, in 1996, that was prior to her diagnosis. She was diagnosed in 98, and you can see her handwriting has progressively decreased and becomes more and more illegible. 2006, it's pretty illegible. And then when she enrolled in our study, up on the upper right, you can see a big transition there. Her handwriting is very poor, and she's now gone to typing her checks, which for her was a significant decrease in quality of life. She did 8 weeks of forced exercise, and you can see she's writing her checks again, and her handwriting has increased or is improved. So again, we're very encouraged by this because, again, this was an intervention where we were exercising the lower extremities. We weren't doing anything with the upper extremities, yet she was showing some improvements in her handwriting and upper extremity function. Then we tested her again 4 weeks later, post end of treatment, so she had stopped exercising, and you can see her handwriting has regressed a little bit, but it's certainly better than when she started the project. And it looks like it's probably somewhere around the 2006 area. So that's something, again, you don't publish these things, but these are things that patients tell us and note when they're talking to us in terms of what they experienced during the trials. Parkinson's patients, whether you exercise on a voluntary bicycle or the forced mode, you show improvements in the cardiovascular function. So that's good. So the bottom line there is, get out and exercise, do some movement, because you can experience the benefits of exercise. The individuals in the forced group had a 35% improvement in motor function compared to baseline data. So again, we're trying to use this to potentially augment or as an adjunct to medication and possibly surgical intervention. So again, that was our first evidence that we have this global change in motor function. So these are some very recent data that we've gathered, and we gathered them because of some comments that 3 patients made to us during the trial. One said, "I smelled diesel fuel for the first time in 10 years today," and we were like, "Oh, that's interesting." And then the other said, "I went in and I told my wife the house smells like onions," and she said, "You can't smell onions," and he said, "Well, I can now." And the other was, and this was the one that led us to do this test, he said, "I never thought I had body odor, but now I start to smell, I have body odor." And so his olfaction or his smell was improved. And so what we did is we started collecting data using the UPSIT, the University of Pennsylvania Smell Identification Test. Basically, it's a scratch and sniff test. And what we found, which was very interesting, is we showed these improvements in olfaction. And as many of you know, and maybe have experienced, loss of olfaction is typically, or loss of smell is often considered a very early non-motor sign of Parkinson's. And so now we have this ability, or what appears to be, that we're actually improving olfaction levels in these individuals. So those are represented in the blue, and it's as a function of pedaling rate. And so what you see there is individuals who pedaled over 85 RPMs or 83 RPMs mostly showed improvements or got better in their olfaction. Now you'll also see that there are a couple red dots there, and those are patients who were in a voluntary group. They happen to be able to pedal at a relatively high rate. So this goes to this concept of maybe everybody doesn't necessarily need forced exercise, but it points to this idea that it's more of a rate issue. So we were interested in these data. We were like, okay, if we're changing handwriting, we're changing upper extremity function and olfaction, then we must be changing something in the brain. So we brought 10 patients in, had them do 3 sessions, one with a no medication, medication, and then no meds plus exercise at 80 to 90 RPMs. And then we put them in a scanner to look at their pattern of brain activation under these 3 different conditions. And essentially what we see here is the post-exercise, off meds, and then on medication. And I want to focus your attention on the 2 outer MRI scans there, and these are average for 10 patients. You can see on medication on the right, we have activation within the basal ganglia in the middle there. So that's suggesting medication's working. Post-exercise, we see, again, this is off medication, we see a very similar pattern of results. So what it suggests is that we are actually changing brain function through this mode of exercise. So in fact, exercise is most likely medicine for Parkinson's. So, summary. Aerobic exercise improves cardiovascular fitness, so get out and try to move in an aerobic standpoint from a perspective. Forced exercise results are encouraging. We've had, and it looks like the rate of exercise is very important in terms of symptom relief. We've had patients that are able to reduce medication. Again, I'm a PhD, not an MD, so I would never suggest anyone exercise and then try to reduce their medications. And we're actually looking at that question systematically now to determine if patients can reduce medication during exercise. And then again, these very encouraging data with respect to changes in olfaction. So before you start an exercise program, certainly want you to consult your movement disorders neurologist, and if you have a heart condition, your cardiologist. And again, we would recommend a relatively high intensity if possible, 65 to 85% of your target heart rate zone. And one of the things we would suggest is to reduce your resistance and try to increase the pedaling rate or exercise rate, but do it in a safe manner, whether it's stationary cycling, treadmill training, or even stationary rowing. Again, we find that a partner or a group setting appeals to most people, and we want to make sure that you're safe. So we're not recommending you go buy a bike and take to the streets of Phoenix or Las Vegas or wherever you're from. We are starting programs, and we have existing programs called Pedaling for Parkinson's at the Y. Again, this is our effort to get out into the community and to get these things to you rather than taking 5 years to get them published and then finally bringing them to you. And I think that's consistent with Davis's message with respect to living well now and getting these things out to patients as quickly as possible. The other thing is be an active participant in your treatment, and whether that means exercising on a daily or 3 times a week basis, do it. The other part is be a critical consumer of information from your neurologist. Ask them questions, and if you don't understand, ask them more questions. It's okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Parkinson's Podcast. For more information about the Davis-Phinney Foundation and to learn about educational offerings and community events for people affected by Parkinson's, please visit davisfinneyfoundation.org or dpf.org. This podcast includes information about Parkinson's and insights from our Parkinson's community. It is not intended as a substitute for treatment advice from your own medical providers.